Okay, welcome back. This is the third of three lectures I'm reporting this morning, all part of a large lecture called Components of Design. In the first lecture, it was an overview of all design principles and the art elements. In the second lecture, it was a more specific focus on hierarchy and emphasis. And this last lecture is going to be on the topic of design thinking. So the first two lectures will apply to my art appreciation students, but also apply for studio students in a number of classes. Most specifically, I'm recording these so that they can be used in the computers and art class that is also being taught this summer, but hopefully they'll be used in lots of other places. And the last one, the design thinking, is more specific for our studio students, but it may be of interest for our art appreciation, especially some of you who might decide to pursue an art minor or at least want to take a few art classes in the art building. That is, if you are on the W campus in Columbus rather than just remote or on the Tupelo campus. Okay, well, I doubt, based on the fact that no one has actually attended any of these early Saturday morning uh, videos yet. I doubt anyone's going to be coming in, so I think we can go ahead and just get started with sharing screen. And so I'm going to share, and here we are. We're going to go from current slide, try to at least. I am once again going to get rid of my bobblehead over there. And okay, and I'm probably going to sneeze. Yes, I did. I did sneeze. Okay, so the last lecture is on design thinking. And so it is about just here's the issue of some of you may have noticed if you're in the art building that we have these many of us wear these buttons that say Think Design. We also have t-shirts. I think I'm actually wearing one of the Think Design t-shirts right now as I speak. And we're using it as kind of like an overarching campaign, both as part of our branding campaign for the department, but also as an educational campaign trying to emphasize to our students the importance of design thinking. So why are we doing that? Well, the reason is because we feel we have been trying to get our students to be better at using design for a number of years. And the first thing that we did was we tried to really focus on knowing the fundamentals, knowing the art elements, knowing the design principles. And that seemed to do some good, but it was limited. And then we decided, well, we need to really kind of focus on one so that students really learn how to use it, right? So we really focused on hierarchy and emphasis, the lecture that I just did. But we also just still found that they're good at knowing hierarchy and emphasis and applying it when it is like a problem for them to actually apply. But once they get working on general regular art projects or graph design projects, that they tend to throw all of that design knowledge that they learned in design one and design two, they just put it not so much in the trash, but they just put it aside. They don't really realize that they should be using those as tools to help them become better designers. So this is about how do we learn to use our design principle knowledge, our art element and design principle and design concept knowledge. How do we learn to use that as part of our design thinking? So, um, so as you can see from the outline of the lecture, we're going to first talk about some of the key things. Most to start with, you need to know the art elements of design principles. Then we're going to talk about um, becoming aware of what you tend to do, right? Like paying attention to your design instincts. Um, like we had a student a couple of years ago where she just had such an intuitive feel um, for rhythm, repetition, movement that she was always bringing it into all this kind of artwork that she would make. But she struggled in trying to figure out how she could use those good strengths in her actual discipline that she was getting her doing her senior show in. She kind of figured that out eventually, but um, also learning to think in terms of design is also about learning to think formally and visually and abstractly, and most importantly, not thinking literally. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between literal thinking versus visual and abstract thinking, and why it's important to do the visual and abstract thinking. And even when, like, let's say in the field of graphic design where you have to do both, it's important to do both and not just be thinking literally. Okay. Um, and then at the end, we're going to talk about kind of applying these to different stages of kind of a of the design process. Most especially, in this lecture, we're going to be focusing on the idea of applying it at the beginning stages, at the thumbnail stage. But we're also going to talk a little bit about applying it at the middle stage and at the end stage. Okay. So first off, let's start with, what do we mean when we say design thinking, or what can anybody mean? What do other people mean when they say design thinking? So some of the definitions could be knowing and following the design process, going like, okay, first I do research. First, after that, I start doing mind mapping, brainstorming, writing down ideas. Then I do um, lots and lots of thumbnails, and then I create a ton. Then I edit down. I come up with my 5 strongest pieces that I think that could be at a thumbnail stage or at a rough stage. And then I kind of like figure out which of those is going to be pursued more, and then I develop that further, and then I kind of get closer and closer to the finished piece, right? So the design process, and that applies both to graphic design, but it applies to lots of kinds of art. That's one definition of design thinking, and that's a good definition. Another would be thinking about utility, like, and communication. Like if you were an industrial designer or a product designer, you'd be thinking a lot about utility. So you look at the world and you're always thinking to yourself, what is a problem that needs to be solved? What's an object that doesn't do, either it doesn't do the thing it should be doing as well, or that we could rethink this object by thinking about it having a slightly new use, right? And in graphic design, that's a lot about looking at your graphic design work and thinking, how can this communicate more clearly, right? How can I find a better way of communicating this idea? That leads also to the final definition that a lot of people use for design thinking, which is thinking about problem solving. So what do we mean in the Department of Art and Design here at NW? What do we mean by design thinking? Well, we mean all of those things, right? Those are all important, but we also mean applying the formal visual abstract design knowledge, like all the stuff that you learned in design class, design 1 and design 2, the art elements and the design principles and the other design concepts that you learned, applying them, in your design work and in your design thinking all the time. Okay? That's what we mean by design thinking. So first step would be to know your art elements and your design principles. So I'm just showing the images from the first lecture that I gave this morning. And so if you're still unsure, go back and watch that video again. But also, you need to know how you tend to use your design principles, right? So, like, let's think about an artist like Motherwell, right? So he definitely, in a lot of his paintings, he's thinking about figure ground. He's thinking about what is positive, what is negative, kind of playing with that, making the positive and the negative kind of push against each other, which leads to another important part of Motherwell's design language. He liked to think about compression, liked to think about what some artists would call the push and pull, both the push and pull in terms of forward and backward of space, but also the push one into each other, like the way the negative space shapes, because at times they're painted white, right? That they then push against the positive, the black, right? But the black also pushes against the white, but also the black pushes against other black shapes. There's this tug and pull, right? And he tends to think of compositions as being sort of like kind of bounded by the structure of the composition. So he's thinking about page structure, but he likes to think of that page structure as being kind of about being kind of elastic, something that you push against. And so there's also a lot of kind of dynamics in his composition. So an understanding of movement, but not the kind of movement that is like, a repetition and an active movement or a movement across the page. So there's a little bit of that, but it's more about the movement of like things pushing, a tug and a struggle, where a stasis kind of movement, where things are like two things are pushing against an opposite direction. They're not quite moving anywhere, but there's a sense that they're both pushing hard against each other. So all of that is in Robert Motherwell's design language that he figured out as a painter over years and years of painting. So for every studio artist, that's part of the process of learning to think in design, is to figure out what design concepts are relevant to you and what do you tend to use. How do you figure that out? Mostly by making work, but you can figure it out also in the early stages in the design process, which is what we're going to get to. So another point that I make is that you need to be learning to think not just literally. So I made this design here to kind of demonstrate sort of two different ways of solving problems, right? I thought of the phrase literally non-literal, and I thought, okay, what if I tried to solve the literally, tried to communicate that in the most kind of like literal way possible, so that I'm using a typeface that is very much kind of associated with, words associated um, with dictionaries, um, and I'm putting it so that it looks like a dictionary entry, but then also each letter form is created out of the texture of a dictionary page, right? And so it is it is about words, about what is literal, right? But it is also it's literally made up of being about words. Whereas the non-literal part, I'm playing with figure ground and I'm allowing the letter shapes to just kind of push it being just shapes, right? So that I'm allowing them to kind of like the white to bleed out so that we almost don't see, or trying to play with things like that diagonal kind of lining up with that curve so that it's about an interaction of shapes more than it is about the the letter forms being words, right? So in one, I'm thinking of the word as a word. In one, I'm thinking of the word as a means of playing with shapes. So thinking literally versus non-literally. Now, for graphic designers, it's really important that you can't really solve graphic design problems without thinking of those two things simultaneously, because you're always working with words, and you're not just working with words, you're working with the meanings that people are going to apply to those words. You have to show that you're aware of those things, but you also have to be visually thinking about every shape as a shape. So you need to be thinking of every block of texture or every block of text as a shape and also as a visual texture. So you have to be thinking about it abstractly, but you also have to make sure that it reads clearly so that someone reads that block of text and understands exactly what needs to be said. So you also have to be thinking in a more literal way. So, whereas if you're a painter, you are much more free to abandon literalism entirely. Um, so applying this kind of thinking, right, to the various stages of the process. I'm going to mostly focus on the beginning stages, but we'll talk in some abstract terms about how to apply it in other stages. So I picked out, these are originally were used in the junior seminar pages. These are from a graphic designer, Claire Coulon, and it's her blog where she's showing her design process. And I think you can very clearly see her she's thinking about figure ground, she's thinking about um, issues like movement and flow, why she's kind of like playing with, and she tends to kind of think of like multiple solutions. And so sometimes she'll apply, well, how about a more of a figure ground kind of solution for this? Or how about more of a this type of solution? And she's, you can see that like at first it's just kind of like writing, but then it starts to become about like thinking of each letter form as a shape. So that idea of like going from thinking literally to thinking more abstractly. Here are some other examples of people. These are both also graphic designers and they're different kind of design process where they use a much more open-ended design process in their process books for just finding ideas. This leaves them, they're their process books to look very different from their actual graphic design work, but still, it's a very interesting kind of process. And then lastly, I want to talk about, these are some thumbnails that I have done, and I need to explain a little bit the assignment, and then I can kind of explain, because I want to show you these to explain both the idea of like applying design thinking at early stages, thinking both literally and abstractly. But I also want to, but I do first, I need to kind of explain the assignment. So in the junior seminar that students take, one of the things you have to do is you have to do 64 thumbnails. And you need to do 64 thumbnails, and they need to be on a set of themes that are 3 words. Everyone has to pick a word that is an object, a, like a noun. Everyone has to pick a word that is an action, and then like a verb, and then everyone has to pick a word that is kind of a mood, usually an adjective, but it doesn't have to be an adjective. So the object that I chose was shoes. The action was cleaning, and the mood was contemplative. And so they don't, when you do your thumbnails, some of them can just address one word or a different word. Some of them can maybe address 2 words. Some can address all 3 words, but it's not required that they all have to address all 3 words all the way through. But one of the things I want you to see is how, so these are mine. One of the things every year that I teach junior seminar, I try to do a set for a new set of 3 words to kind of go through the same process that the students are going through. And so in this set, the 3 words I chose were shoe, clean, and contemplative. And you can kind of see me kind of working through the ideas, sometimes more literally. So a literal way of like addressing the idea of shoes is to say, what types of shoes are there? There's clogs, there's this kind of shoes, there's Uggs, there's what are those? I can't really remember. I even thought about like Ace Frehley's, or maybe that might actually be a different member of Kiss's shoes. But anyway, shoes from the band Kiss, flip-flops. I hate flip-flops. Boots, all these different kinds of slippers, bunny slippers, different kinds of shoes. That's a very literal way of thinking about variations, right? But then this is more abstract. Like I started thinking about cleats, and then all of a sudden I just got interested in the shapes that cleats can create, right? Um, and I kind of brought that way of thinking into other things. I think I was still thinking about shoes here, but then I think here I might actually be thinking about a plate. I can't even remember what I'm thinking about, but I was just more looking for shapes. Um, so like that's still just a little bit of a hint of a shoe, but and then like kind of the idea of a cloth in front of it. And I tried to be thinking somewhat like a graphic designer at times and somewhat more like an illustrator at times. So, so it's the idea of kind of bringing design thinking, thinking about things abstractly, thinking about them as shape, thinking about plays of figure ground, right? Plays of figure ground that can be more kind of like design, more graphic design kind of related, but plays of figure ground that can be more illustrative kind of related. And thinking about repetition and creation of movement. And so there are some, like this is a good example of one that's about, in it we have shoes. It's also contemplative because of the space and the way I'm using space. And it's also about cleaning. It's about like taking off your shoes ahead, when you're about to mop a floor kind of thing. Um, so lastly, I'd want to talk a little bit about bringing the design thinking to other stages. I don't really have any images to show with this, but I just want to say that like you can you can also bring your design thinking, not just at the beginning stages. I think it's really important to like at beginning stages, kind of push yourself to go like, hey, can I think more abstractly about this? Or hey, can I bring more of a thought about economy, or more thought about um, figure ground, or more thought about movement and repetition. And that could be also like where you trying to ask yourself the question of like, what's appropriate? Like, let's say you're a graphic designer and you're doing a logo design for a running shoe company. Well, you probably would think, well, maybe I need to be thinking about movement, rhythm, repetition, movement, and dynamics, all of those things the most, right? Like I need to be thinking about what kind of shapes create movement, because if it's a running company, movement is going to be a major part of that. Um, but it could also just be as a general rule, you could just say every time I do thumbnails, I want to at least do a few that are plays on figure ground and a few that are plays on how to make these concepts the most economical. Or I want to think about how I can make some of my thumbnails be about how maybe rhythm and repetition might be the way to address the problem. So, so you could do it at the beginning stage, but you can also do it at kind of the middle stages where like you're working on works and you can ask yourself questions like, am I doing, is there a design principle that I should have been thinking about that I wasn't? Or are there kind of like design flaws? That's one of the reasons why hierarchy and emphasis is such a great kind of a tool to learn, because you can use it to almost like a diagnostic tool with your artwork. You could ask yourself the question, what should be the most important areas of emphasis? What should be the primary emphasis? What should be the secondary emphasis? And then you ask yourself the question, am I doing that? In what ways am I supporting that idea that this should be the primary emphasis, this should be the secondary emphasis, this should be the tertiary emphasis? And in what ways am I not doing that? In what ways am I maybe making something else that is really shouldn't be a major emphasis, making something too important an emphasis? Okay, so you could do that at the middle stages, that kind of diagnostic, what's wrong with my work kind of way, or that diagnostic, maybe I haven't pushed my thinking far enough in the middle of the process of making a work of art. And then you can also do that at the end in a critique stage or in a finesse stage, where once again, you're asking yourself, could this be better? In what ways could be better? And in what ways could design thinking, thinking more abstractly, help to make this better? Okay, that is the end of this lecture. So I'm going to go to stop share. And thank you very much for those of you who are watching this video. I'll be posting them eventually. They'll be posted on YouTube, but I'm also going to be sending them as actual videos to some professors. All right, well, thank you very much. And I'll see many of you later.